There's this quiet panic that lives in the background of modern life, this persistent feeling that you're not where you're supposed to be, that everyone else figured something out that you missed, that there's an invisible timeline you're falling behind on and the gap keeps getting wider, and you see it everywhere, in the success stories that flood your social media, in the milestones your friends are hitting, in the achievements of strangers half your age who seem to have their entire lives figured out while you're still trying to figure out what you want to be when you grow up, even though you're already supposedly grown up. And this feeling, this sense of being perpetually behind, it's not about actual failure, it's not about objectively doing poorly, it's about the gap between where you are and where you think you should be, and that gap feels unbridgeable. It feels like evidence that you've wasted time or made wrong choices or simply aren't capable of catching up to wherever on track is supposed to be. The comparison trap is relentless. You can't escape it. Every time you open your phone, you're confronted with evidence of other people's progress, their promotions and engagements and home purchases and perfect vacations and creative projects and bodies and relationships. And your brain doesn't process this as, here's one highlight from someone's entire life. It processes it as, everyone else is winning and I'm losing. Everyone else is moving forward and I'm stuck. Everyone else figured out the game and I'm still reading the instructions. And this constant comparison creates a reality distortion where you're always behind because there will always be someone ahead of you in any dimension you care to measure. There will always be someone younger who's achieved more, someone your age who's further along, someone older who figured it out faster. And if you're measuring yourself against everyone else's highlight reel, you're measuring yourself against an impossible composite that no actual human being could match. What makes the feeling of being behind so destructive is that it's not actually about your real life. It's about a fictional timeline that exists only in your head, this narrative about where you're supposed to be by certain ages, what you're supposed to have accomplished, what your life is supposed to look like. And most of this narrative isn't even yours. It's absorbed from culture and parents and peers and social media and movies and advertising. It's this cobbled-together story of what success is supposed to look like and when it's supposed to happen. And the story is bullshit. It's not based on your actual values or circumstances or desires. It's based on some imaginary average person living some imaginary average life hitting imaginary average milestones. And you're comparing your real messy complex life to this fiction and feeling inadequate because you don't match it. I spent my 20s feeling catastrophically behind, watching friends get married and buy houses and advance in careers while I was still figuring out what I wanted to do, still making what felt like entry-level mistakes, still living like a college student while everyone else seemed to be transitioning into proper adulthood. And the anxiety was constant, this low-grade hum of panic about wasted time, about being too old to start over, about missing some crucial window where things were supposed to click into place, and none of it was based on what I actually wanted. I didn't even want half the things I felt behind on. I was just terrified of not having them because other people my age did, because the timeline said I should, because being behind felt like being wrong, like being less than, like proof that something fundamental was broken in me. The arbitrary nature of these timelines becomes obvious when you actually examine them. Why is 30 supposed to be some deadline for having your life together? Why is 25 supposed to be too old to start something new? Why is there supposed to be a right order for things to happen in? Why does buying a house before getting married make more sense than the reverse? Or why does either of them need to happen at all? Who decided that career success in your 30s is on time but career success in your 40s is late? And the answer is nobody decided, it's just convention. It's just what enough people happen to do that it became the expected pattern. But it's not a law, it's not even good advice for most people. It's just a story we tell ourselves about how life is supposed to go. And the story doesn't account for the infinite variations in human experience, in circumstances, in desires, in the fact that people are different and want different things and move at different speeds, and there is no one correct way to live a life. The feeling of being behind also assumes that life is a race, that there's a finish line you're trying to reach before everyone else, that arriving at certain milestones faster is better, that earlier equals more successful, and this is fundamentally wrong. Life isn't a race. There's no prize for finishing first. The person who gets married at 22 isn't winning over the person who gets married at 42. They're just living different lives, making different choices, prioritizing different things, and one isn't inherently better than the other, they're just different. But we've internalized this competitive framework where faster is better and later is worse, and if you're not hitting milestones on schedule, you're losing. And this framework makes it impossible to be satisfied with your actual life because you're always measuring it against some imaginary ideal timeline instead of asking whether your life is actually good for you, whether you're moving in a direction that matters to you, whether you're building something that feels meaningful regardless of how it compares to anyone else's timeline. Part of what perpetuates the feeling of being behind is that we only see the outcome. not the process. You see someone's success, but you don't see the 10 years of failure that preceded it. You see someone's perfect relationship, but you don't see the 3 terrible relationships they had to learn from first. You see someone's dream job, but you don't see the years of unemployment or underemployment or jobs they hated that taught them what they actually wanted. And because you only see the highlight, you assume it came easily. You assume they were always on track. You assume they didn't feel behind the way you feel behind. And this assumption is almost always wrong. Almost everyone feels behind. Almost everyone thinks everyone else has it figured out. Almost everyone is comparing their messy reality to everyone else's curated exterior and feeling inadequate. And if you could see the full picture, if you could see the doubt and the setbacks and the false starts and the years of feeling lost, you'd realize that being behind is actually the normal state, that almost nobody is where they thought they'd be, that the people who look like they're ahead are mostly just good at hiding the parts that don't fit the narrative. The question that actually matters isn't, am I behind? But, behind what? Behind whose timeline? Behind which version of success? Behind what story about how life is supposed to go? And when you dig into this, you usually find that the timeline you're measuring yourself against isn't even one you chose. It's not based on what you actually want or value. It's based on what you think you're supposed to want, what other people have, what society says success looks like. And this is the trap. You're feeling behind on a race you never actually wanted to run. You're anxious about not reaching destinations you don't actually care about arriving at. You're just anxious because the script says you should be there by now and you're not. But the script isn't your life. The script is just a story, and you can choose to stop living by it. What helped me break out of this was getting clear on what I actually wanted versus what I thought I was supposed to want. And the gap between those two was enormous. So much of what I felt behind on was stuff I didn't actually care about. I felt behind on career advancement in fields I wasn't even interested in. Behind on acquiring possessions I didn't want, behind on reaching milestones that meant nothing to me. I was just anxious because I didn't have them and other people did, because the timeline said I should. But when I actually asked myself what mattered to me, what I wanted my life to look like, what would make me feel fulfilled, most of the things I felt behind on weren't even on the list. And this realization was both liberating and infuriating. Liberating because I could stop caring about things that didn't matter. Infuriating because I'd wasted so much time and energy feeling inadequate about not having things I didn't even want. Once you start separating what you actually want from what you think you're supposed to want, the feeling of being behind starts to lose its grip, because you realize that most of the race you're running is imaginary. Most of the milestones you're anxious about missing are things you don't actually care about reaching. And the only reason you care is because everyone else seems to care, because society has designated them as important, because not having them feels like failure even when having them wouldn't actually make you happy. And this recognition is the beginning of freedom, the beginning of building a life based on your actual values instead of inherited expectations. But here's the thing that makes this difficult. Even when you intellectually understand that the timeline is arbitrary and the comparisons are meaningless and you don't actually want the things you feel behind on, the feeling doesn't just disappear, the anxiety doesn't evaporate, because the feeling of being behind isn't rational, it's emotional, it's deep, it's tied to your sense of worth and belonging and whether you're acceptable, whether you're doing life right, whether you're enough, and those questions can't be answered by logic. They require a different kind of work, a deeper kind of untangling. The anxiety about being behind is often really anxiety about being left out, about being different in a way that makes you unacceptable, about not fitting into the story of how life is supposed to go and therefore being somehow wrong or broken or less than. And this fear is primal, it's tribal, it's the ancient human fear of being cast out of the group. And in modern life, this manifests as anxiety about not hitting the same milestones as your peers, not being at the same life stage, not being able to relate to the conversations everyone else is having about mortgages or children or career advancement. And the fear is that if you're too different, if you're too far off the path, you won't belong, you'll be excluded, you'll be alone. Understanding this helps because it reveals what you're actually afraid of. You're not really afraid of being 30 without a house. You're afraid that not having a house by 30 means something is wrong with you. You're not really afraid of being single at 35. You're afraid that being single means you're unlovable or defective. You're not really afraid of changing careers at 40. You're afraid that changing careers means you wasted your life or that you're a failure. And these fears are about identity and worth, not about the actual circumstances. And once you see that, once you recognize that the thing you're actually afraid of is being judged or being less than or being wrong, you can start to address the real issue, which is your relationship to yourself and your need for external validation. The brutal truth is that you can't actually catch up, because caught up doesn't exist. It's a moving target. It's a mythical state where you've achieved enough and done enough and become enough that you can finally relax and stop feeling inadequate. But that state never arrives, because as soon as you reach one milestone, you're behind on the next one. As soon as you achieve one thing, you're comparing yourself to someone who's achieved more. The goalposts keep moving. The standards keep rising. And if you're waiting to feel caught up before you feel okay about yourself, you're going to be waiting forever, because the game is designed to be unwinnable. What actually works is opting out of the game entirely, is deciding that you're not going to measure your life against other people's lives or against some cultural script about what you're supposed to have accomplished by now, is choosing to define success on your own terms based on what actually matters to you, what actually brings meaning and satisfaction and growth. And this sounds simple, but it's one of the hardest things you can do because it requires you to give up the security of external validation. It requires you to stop looking to other people to tell you whether you're doing okay. It requires you to trust your own judgment about what constitutes a good life, even when that judgment conflicts with what everyone else seems to be doing. I know someone who spent years feeling behind because they weren't climbing the corporate ladder like their peers. They were working part-time jobs that gave them flexibility to pursue creative projects that mattered to them but didn't make money. And everyone around them was getting promotions and buying houses and building retirement accounts, and they were living in a small apartment working on things that might never amount to anything. And the anxiety was crushing, the sense that they were wasting their life, that they were falling further behind every year, that eventually they'd wake up at 50 with nothing to show for their choices. But then something shifted. They stopped measuring their life against the conventional timeline and started measuring it against whether they were doing things that felt meaningful, whether they were learning and growing and creating things they cared about, and the feeling of being behind just dissolved, not because their circumstances changed, but because the measuring stick changed. This doesn't mean circumstances don't matter. If you're struggling financially or stuck in a situation that's genuinely bad for you, then just change your perspective isn't going to solve the problem. You need to change the actual situation. But often the feeling of being behind exists even when your circumstances are fine, even when you're doing okay by any objective measure. You just feel behind because you're comparing yourself to an impossible standard or because you've internalized someone else's timeline. And in those cases, changing your relationship to the comparison is what frees you. The other shift that helps is understanding that there is no singular path, there's no one right way to build a life. And the idea that there's a correct sequence of milestones that everyone should follow, is absurd when you actually think about it, because people are so different, they have different gifts and challenges and desires and circumstances. What works for one person is completely wrong for another. And trying to follow someone else's path is like trying to wear someone else's clothes. It might technically fit, but it's never going to feel right. It's never going to be yours. Your path is allowed to be weird, it's allowed to be non-linear, it's allowed to include detours and backtracking and starting over, it's allowed to not make sense to other people, it's allowed to look nothing like what you thought it would look like. And none of that means you're behind, it just means you're building something custom, something that fits your actual life instead of some generic template, and custom takes longer, it's messier. It requires more trial and error. But the result is something that's actually yours, something that actually works for you, instead of a life that looks right from the outside but feels wrong on the inside. The comparison to other people is always going to be there. You can't completely eliminate it. Human brains are wired to notice what others are doing and measure ourselves against them. But you can change your relationship to the comparison. You can notice when you're doing it and choose not to let it define your worth. You can look at someone else's success and feel genuinely happy for them instead of threatened by them. You can acknowledge that their timeline is different from your timeline. And that's okay, that there's room for multiple ways of living, that someone else doing well doesn't mean you're doing poorly. Part of what makes the feeling of being behind so persistent is that it's reinforced constantly. Every time you open social media, every time you go to a reunion or a family gathering, every time someone asks what you're up to and you have to explain why you're not where you thought you'd be, the comparison is right there, the judgment is right there, real or imagined, and it takes active effort to resist it. To maintain your own definition of success in the face of constant evidence that other people are using a different definition and seemingly succeeding by it. What helps is finding people who are living non-traditional paths, who opted out of the conventional timeline and built lives that work for them, even if those lives don't look impressive to others. Because when you see examples of people who are genuinely happy and fulfilled while doing things completely differently, it breaks the spell. It shows you that the conventional path isn't the only path, that you can deviate from the script and still be okay, still be more than okay, and these examples are permission. They're proof that alternative ways of living are viable. The timeline anxiety also tends to spike at certain ages, the big round numbers, 30, 40, 50, because those feel like checkpoints where you're supposed to have achieved certain things, and if you haven't, if you're arriving at 30 or 40 without the house or the partner or the career success or whatever milestone you've internalized as necessary, the panic intensifies, the sense that time is running out, that you've missed your chance, that it's too late. But this is also arbitrary. The idea that 30 is some kind of deadline is completely made up. Plenty of people start completely new lives at 30 or 40 or 60. Plenty of people achieve their most meaningful work later in life. Plenty of people find love or success or fulfillment well past the age when they thought they were supposed to have those things, and their lives aren't lesser for it, they're just different. The shift from feeling perpetually behind to feeling okay with where you are isn't a single moment of enlightenment, it's a gradual process of catching yourself in the comparison, questioning the timeline you're measuring against, choosing to focus on what you're building rather than what you're missing, and doing this over and over until it becomes more natural than the anxiety. Until your default response to seeing someone else's success is curiosity or inspiration rather than inadequacy. Until you can acknowledge where you are without immediately comparing it to where you think you should be. This requires a kind of radical self-acceptance that doesn't come easily in a culture that's built on competition and comparison, that profits from your feeling of inadequacy, that wants you to believe you're behind so you'll buy the course or the product or the lifestyle that promises to help you catch up. And resisting this, choosing to be okay with your own timeline, choosing to define success on your own terms, is an act of rebellion. It's refusing to participate in a system that's designed to keep you feeling insufficient. The practical work of this is daily. It's noticing when you're scrolling through social media and starting to feel that familiar anxiety rising, and choosing to close the app instead of spiraling. It's catching yourself in the middle of a comparison and asking, what am I actually afraid of here? It's recognizing when you're pursuing something because you genuinely want it versus because you think you're supposed to want it. It's learning to sit with the discomfort of being different without interpreting it as being wrong. And none of this is easy. All of it requires practice, requires catching yourself hundreds of times before it starts to shift. What I've found is that the feeling of being behind diminishes in direct proportion to how much you're engaged with actually building your life versus thinking about building your life. When you're actively working on things that matter to you, when you're learning or creating or connecting or growing, you don't have mental bandwidth to worry about what everyone else is doing. You're too busy doing your own thing. But when you're stuck or procrastinating or avoiding or just consuming other people's content without creating anything yourself, that's when the comparison spiral hits hardest, because you're watching everyone else live while you're not fully living yourself. The question isn't really, how do I stop feeling behind? The question is, how do I build a life that feels meaningful to me regardless of how it compares to anyone else's life? And that question doesn't have a universal answer, it has your answer, which requires you to figure out what actually matters to you, what you're willing to sacrifice for, what success looks like in your own terms. And this is harder than following a conventional timeline because there's no roadmap, there's no clear markers of whether you're on track. You just have to trust yourself and keep adjusting as you go. The other thing that helps is zooming out. When you're caught in the feeling of being behind, you're usually zoomed in too close. You're looking at where you are right now and comparing it to where someone else is right now, or where you think you should be right now. But if you zoom out and look at the trajectory, look at where you've been and where you're going, look at what you've learned and how you've grown and what you're building toward, the picture changes. You might be behind on certain milestones but ahead on others. You might have taken a longer route but learned more along the way. You might not look successful by conventional standards but be building something more authentic and sustainable. There's also something to be said for embracing the idea that being behind might actually be an advantage, that taking longer means you have more time to figure out what you actually want instead of rushing into the first available option, that starting later means you're starting with more wisdom and self-knowledge, that doing things out of order means you're not constrained by conventional thinking about how things are supposed to go. And I'm not saying being behind is always good or that you should romanticize struggle. But there's often value in the non-linear path that isn't visible when you're in the middle of it feeling anxious about not being where everyone else is. The comparison culture isn't going away, social media isn't going away, the pressure to perform and achieve and display your life isn't going away. If anything, it's intensifying, which means the skill of managing your relationship to comparison is only going to become more important, the ability to see someone else's success without making it about your failure. The ability to be happy with your own progress without needing it to be faster or more impressive than someone else's progress. The ability to define your own metrics for a good life and stick to them even when everyone around you is using different metrics. I want to acknowledge that some of you watching this might be in situations where you genuinely are behind in ways that matter, where you're struggling and everyone else seems fine, where the gap between where you are and where you need to be feels real and urgent. And if that's you, I'm not saying the answer is just to change your perspective. Sometimes you need to change your circumstances. Sometimes you need actual help and resources and support. Sometimes the feeling of being behind is a signal that something needs to change. But even in those situations, the comparison to others isn't usually helpful. What's helpful is focusing on what you can control, what actions you can take, what support you can seek, what small step you can make today toward where you want to be. The path forward isn't about catching up. It's about letting go of the idea that you need to catch up. It's about building your own timeline based on what matters to you. It's about measuring progress against your own values instead of against other people's achievements. It's about trusting that your life doesn't need to look like anyone else's life to be valid and meaningful and good. And this trust doesn't come all at once. It comes gradually, through repeated choices to focus on your own path instead of everyone else's path. Through repeated reminders that there's no one right way to build a life. Through repeated practice of being okay with being exactly where you are while still working toward where you want to be. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If this resonated with you or helped you think differently about where you are in your life, I'd appreciate if you subscribed. I make videos about these kinds of topics regularly, and your subscription helps this content reach more people who might need to hear it. Here's what I want you to take away. You're not behind, you're just on a different timeline, and different doesn't mean wrong. It doesn't mean less than, it doesn't mean you've failed or wasted time or missed your chance. It just means you're building something custom, something that fits your actual life instead of some generic template. And custom takes longer, it's messier, it requires more trial and error, but the result is yours, it's authentic. It's meaningful in ways that following someone else's path never could be. Stop measuring your chapter 1 against someone else's chapter 20. Stop comparing your behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. Stop judging your worth based on arbitrary timelines invented by a culture that profits from your inadequacy. And start building the life you actually want at the pace that actually works for you. Start defining success in terms that actually matter to you. Start trusting that your path is valid even when it doesn't look like anyone else's path. Because it is, you are, and the only person you need to keep pace with is yourself. The feeling of being behind will probably never completely disappear. It'll show up sometimes, especially during transitions or when you're comparing yourself to others or when you hit those big round number ages. But it doesn't have to run your life. It doesn't have to determine your worth. It doesn't have to stop you from building something meaningful. You can acknowledge the feeling without believing it. You can notice the comparison without letting it define you. You can be exactly where you are while still working toward where you want to be. And that's enough. You're enough right now, exactly as you are, behind or not.